everyone. Welcome to the Stoa, the rise of Doomer Optimism, with Jason Snyder and Ashley Colby. So, for those of you who might know that Jason was here, was it a month or so ago, and did a session on Doomer Optimism, sort of from like a meta modern perspective, talking about the different kind of cultures and subcultures surrounding the scene that he's in, and it kind of like was a pretty hot video. Got a lot of good buzz, and then people were requesting Jason to come back, and me and Jason were kind of talking about a return, and he said to invite Ashley with him, and as they thought they were going to have a pretty cool series on Doomer Optimism. And so this is the first session of a series here at the Stoa on the subject. And I imagine, well, maybe I'll take in Jason in a moment. And you can kind of talk a little bit about that and properly introduce Ashley. So before I do that, how today's going to work is after Jason introduces Ashley, Ashley's going to present some slides on Doomer Optimism, and then Jason and Ashley will have a conversation, and then we'll pivot to the Q&A. So if you have any questions throughout, just put them in the chat. I'll call on you and you can ask your question, either Jason or Ashley, and then we can have an organic conversation. If you don't want to be on YouTube, because this will be on YouTube, just indicate that and I'll read your question. And Ashley's Wi-Fi wasn't the greatest, so her video is off, but her audio should be fine. So that's being said, I will take Jason in. Welcome back to the Stoa, my friend.
It's good to be back, Peter. Hello, all you beautiful people. Yeah, well, I just, I mainly want to introduce Ashley. I think many of you know Ashley. I think, she's just a very enthusiastic, infectious, very knowledgeable person. And so I thought, hey, let's do a series together. We'll have a series where we have conversations with fellow Doomer Optimists or, adjacent spaces, but also invite some special guests on that many of us have probably heard of. But without further ado, I think Ashley is going to present kind of the what, why, how, like starting to kind of flesh out, what is this kind of attractor point? A lot of us know that there's a lot of problems in the world, but being depressed isn't going to get you very far. And so what does it mean to be an optimist in this world? So without further ado, well, actually, let me introduce Ashley a little bit more. Ashley has a PhD in environmental sociology. She did her dissertation on subsistence food systems, subsistence agriculture in the United States. Apparently it's more common than many of us think, even in cities. And now she's with her husband in Uruguay, and they run a resilience field school, which they can talk about. And she's all over Twitter and very, I think, kind of a mimetic mediator, I would say, in this space, and bringing together a lot of different people, and very encouraging. So that's why, I wanted her to come on and do this series together. So Ashley, why don't you take it forward?
Sure. Thanks so much. Thanks, Peter, for having us. Thanks, Jason, for inviting me. I've been hearing a lot about the Stoa, especially from Chris D. So I know that it's a really cool community. If at any point, like my audio is weird or something, I'll be looking at the chat. So just tell me. It's rural, internet in Uruguay, it is what it is. So I'm just gonna start by sharing my screen and doing a little PowerPoint. Back in January of 2020, Jason was, and feel free to jump in at any time, Jason was talking about Doomer Optimism without putting these two words together. So this whole slideshow is just going to be tweets, because like this whole thing is only on Twitter. It's just something in our minds on Twitter. So I'm going to just show a bunch of tweets which represent people's, thoughts and sharing in this, very online world that we all live in now. So Jason tweeted this: "I'm not a doomer, I'm a pragmatic optimist," back in January of 2020. And then in January 2021, I said peak Doomer Optimism, it turns out. I asked Jason, do you like the name Doomer Optimists? And Jason.
Did we just lose Ashley completely?
We might have. That's not good. Well, she did send me the PowerPoint beforehand.
And I'm back. Can everybody hear me again?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes. Okay.
Okay, so where were we? So we were here. Or this one?
You tell me what's the last thing you saw.
Let's start here. So you coined the term, and then what?
Okay, so if you could make this bigger, that will help me read it better. Put it in presentation mode. Okay, because I just made this today, so I have to remind myself what's on it. Okay, so so we came up with this name for ourselves, Doomer Optimism. The original idea I was addressing with this was thinking about the price of farmland potentially collapsing as a result of a new Dust Bowl. So pure doomer attitude there. But then maybe as a result of the price of farmland collapsing, people will be able to easily repopulate in rural areas. So that was the example that started this Doomer optimism idea. I believe that we were scouring Twitter today to try to find out the day it started. Okay, so let's see the next slide. Yeah, again, so you just need to, the point here is just hold the label lightly. It's just something I'm putting on, but I kind of have this philosophical perspective that it's quite important to not take yourself too seriously as a movement in general and not be too self-conscious. So again, it's just sort of this lighthearted way of thinking about a label for a way of thinking. Next slide. Okay, next slide. You've got a doomer before you can optimism. The example here, and I think this is important, when you can't just go straight to optimism. You can't just be hopelessly not engaging with well, at least to be a doomer optimist, you have to engage with exactly where we're at, thinking about it from a realistic perspective, like the real challenges we face in the world, being a grown-up, noticing those things, and then thinking, well, what can I do despite or despite the challenges or with those challenges as limits. Next slide. Okay, so here's one way of thinking about it, the temporal way to pass through to become a doomer optimist. You might start as a consumer, you might move on and be angry with society and become a looter. You might think, well, we can just expand nuclear energy or live on Mars or whatever and become an eco-modernist. Then you realize that probably won't work, so then you become a doomer. And then finally, to move past your depression, you can accept that despite the doomer world we live in, you must continue moving forward, and that's the acceptance phase. Next slide. So some examples of doomer optimism. I loved this. Ed Abbey is one of my heroes. In social affairs, I'm an optimist. I really do believe our military industrial civilization will soon collapse. The peak doomer optimism right there. It's just, the idea here is that there's something to look forward to in the next system. We don't want this system to continue. We want something different. So, so the idea of, accepting that we're in this collapse and it's a really gloomy time, just opens up the possibility for what's next. Next slide. Okay, so a couple of actual tangible examples here. Here's one. The lockdown results in walkable human scale streets. Outdoor dining's become obvious. Cities are converting streets back to walking malls across the country, enhancing the physical space we share. That to me is an example of doomer optimism, something kind of terrible happens, people do new things, and then some different ways of being result. Next slide. This is a thread I did with just pulling from some people I really admire. Here's one way Doomer Optimism can look, and this is just people planting 500 trees and making hedgerows on their property. Another example here is Chelsea Norman putting together her raised beds, new orchard, reconfiguring the chicken area. The idea here being, you know, despite the challenges of the world we're in, like move toward creation, move toward making something that's positive for the world. Next slide. Chelsea Norman, again, kind of my hero, making bread, making yogurt, making mayo. She stopped buying things in the store, turning herself into a producer. Very cool thing to do. I use myself an example of the rural schools here in Uruguay that are a different kind of model for schooling. Got Josh, I see Josh here, making some sap out of some concrete blocks and some fire there. So again, like just experimenting with these different acts of creation. And there's people doing this all over Twitter, and I'm just kind of like the curator of it. Next slide. Yeah, just more pictures and examples, but I do want to point out this Neil Clark thread where he talks about the love of cleaning this old stove every year, and that how he enjoys getting up in the morning in the winter and like stoking the stove for his family so that they're warm when they wake up. Like, oh my gosh, what a beautiful act, you know, and something to share and something to look forward to every day. This tradition of cleaning out this stove every year, and this tradition of using, you know, this old piece of equipment for warmth and cooking. It's just, lovely. Okay, next slide. And I think it's really important to think of this as like a diverse set of activities. It's, you know, our acts of creation, the next system that will come as a result of the failure of this system are like literally should be as diverse as human like history, culture, geography. So it's really just about being driven by the will to live and thrive despite the challenges. Next slide. Patrick, my husband, made it into the slideshow. He was very happy today when he looked through it. So doomsday is not a day. It's more like a century or two. And it's not the case that no one lived a life of dignity in the fall of Rome. Give them age-appropriate doses of truth. This is about parenting in the era of doomerism. What do you do about it? You shield them from opportunistic sensationalism, embrace dignity where you can find it, model that, model creative acts. Next slide. Big picture Doomer Optimism, next slide. Jason, you have anything to say on this one? You should probably speak for yourself rather than me speaking for you.
Well, there's a lot of pills going around these days on the internet. I mean, you can take a lot of different pills these days. You know, we transitioned from physical pills to mimetic pills. And I just want to take whatever color pill is responsible for building the communities that we want to see in the world. I think it really starts with, you know, yourself, your household, your community, your watershed, your bioregion, and then the planet. That's all I'm saying there.
Nice. Oh yeah, Jason, sorry, you're on again. This is a really good one. So I called this the Doomer Optimist Call to Arms. I loved this.
Yeah, well, this came about because people were mentioning that, hey, there's all these kind of like, you know, kind of neo-homesteaders, people who are interested in like, or community gardens, but we're all kind of scattered to the wind, and so we're kind of isolated. And so wouldn't it be great if we were all kind of together in one place? And, you know, what if we were all in New Hampshire or, you know, Southern Appalachia or the Pacific Northwest? And, you know, I think that an alternative model is that we're all kind of seeds scattered to the wind. And it's our responsibility to raise up a village, to, you know, to bring people into kind of this new creative and optimistic way of being despite the challenges. And so instead of all getting together and just becoming kind of like this, I don't know, this kind of segmented off, isolated group that's trying to live a different way, like we are connected, we're trading ideas and insight, but we're all in our own places and we're all trying to have impacts on our own communities. And so each of us, if we're inspired by this, we should be operating where we are, in the conditions that we find ourselves in.
Okay, I wanted to make this smiley face on this because I was on the Jim Rutt show recently, and he a lot of things are Game B adjacent to Jim Rutt because he's like the Game B guy, and so since I'm the Doomer Optimist guy, everything is to me like Doomer Optimist adjacent. So I'm kind of making fun of myself here. So next slide. The first adjacent Doomer Optimist, and Joe is going to be in the next Doomer Optimist session, is Joe Norman, who is like such a reluctant label user, but totally respect that. He was like, I don't know if I'm a Doomer Optimist. I'm like, Joe, it's not anything. Just go with it. It's just fun. Let's go. Anyway, so I'm just drew him in here because he's like kind of playfully using the label here, and I think that's really important. Next slide. We don't have to read all this, but another adjacent Doomer Optimist. Maybe you could say, Jason, this is the Green Wizard.
Yeah, this is from a book, John Michael Greer, How to Become a Green Wizard. And hopefully we're actually going to have John Michael Greer on this series, hopefully. And this whole book is just talking about ways, there was a whole movement in the 70s of the appropriate tech movement that kind of got forgotten about, in the 80s, when everybody, kind of really got into Wall Street or, selling out or whatever they did. And I really like this framing of becoming a green wizard because it speaks to like the ecological consciousness, but also like, learning how to do things, being good with your hands, learning how to build things, learning how to, cook and warm yourself and all of these things using, innovative technology that's not high tech, right? So finding, recovering a lot of this innovation that happened in the 70s and kind of got forgot about.
Yes, and another adjacent Doomer Optimist is Chris Smage, author of A Small Farm Future. We're hoping to have him on, but he was saying, let's be optimistic. Present political economy indeed is doomed. Let's strive for one that's better. He also at one point was talking about how the Middle Ages, somebody was saying like the Middle Ages were terrible, they were the Dark Ages, and he was like, who are the Middle Ages bad for? Like maybe they were good for peasants. So anyways, we'll interrogate him on that point.
Yeah, he might be another guest. Well, he probably will be another guest. He's a good principal. Yep.
Yeah, he seems interested. That'll be earlier in the day.
And
all right, next slide.
He wrote a book.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Future, which I highly recommend. It was very influential in our circles.
This is really important, I think, and I think that probably one of our panels should be focused on this topic, which is the trees versus rockets problem. So, basically there's lots of back and forth, about the Jevons paradox, et cetera, different people addressing what are the limits, what are the material limits to this future that we want to see happen. I tend on the Luddite end of the spectrum, but I remain open to the rocket people. And not all the rocket people are like, I'm kind of joking here, obviously, they're not all full rocket people. They're like half tree, half rocket people. So anyways, these Doomer Optimist adjacent movement where people are trying to think about what is the ideal next system. And so we might want to do like an eco-modernist versus Luddite panel as a part of this series, or at least it'll probably go there anyways, even if we don't curate it actively. It always does. Next slide. Where do we go from here? Okay. Yeah, so like, what is it, in March, like I just was talking about Doomer Optimism, and all of a sudden I said, like, you know, people were saying like, how do we organize? And we said like, we should do some sort of series, which this is now, the result of that, basically, you know, interest. And I started putting together a Doomer Optimist Twitter list, and people were saying add me to the list. So I have that list going on my my page if you want to follow it. And Jason, I don't know, maybe you want to talk about I guess you already kind of talked about this, but the idea being the Doomer Optimist archipelago, seeds planted everywhere, as opposed to, you know, like a one singular Doomer Optimist village. If there's anything else you want to add to that.
Yeah, I mean, you know, communes were tried in the 70s and mostly failed. My parents met on a commune. They eventually left that kind of lifestyle. So let's do what we can where we find ourselves. And the difference is that we're connected through the internet, so we have this technology. But let's be resourceful and build the villages we want to see in the world.
Let's see, next slide. Did it go yet? Okay, there you go. Yeah, so the next steps, we're gonna have Jason pull out his scythe and then do like a competition right now. No, I'm just kidding. Against there's this video, it's this like, you know, Luddite guy with a scythe cutting grass next to a guy with a weed whacker. So, you know, just kind of fun, playful ways of thinking about, like, you know, what does the future look like? And, you know, I think the way I envision it too, it can be super diverse, it can be playful, it can be, you know, games, it can be retreats, it can be conversations, but all in the spirit of thinking like, what's the next system? How can we do something fun, exciting, playful, that's creative and positive? Next, is there anything next? Yeah, so I just tweeted this. I'm interacting with some people some of whom are here or mentioned here, that are so grown up and so thoughtful and creative. And like these interactions I've been having with people who are exploring creative alternatives, building the infrastructure for creative alternatives. They just make me feel really hopeful. And I think there's something to the idea that Doomer Optimism does involve some amount of being a grown-up. It's not really about, you know, pure hedonism as the potential future. I think that's pretty doomery in my opinion. I'm not like, you know, I think the creative acts that will make up the next system are couched in like responsibility. I mean, it can still be creative, it can still be fun, but I think, like, you know, when you get adults in the room, it's just a different thing than I think focusing solely on, like, I don't know, whatever music festival. It's not all just music festivals and communes and like drugs, you know. The idea is like, we're actually trying to be responsible here. Think of the next system, and add our contribution to it. And it doesn't have to be, you know, we don't have to all reinvent the wheel, but I think we all do think we have to do our part in some way. So there is some measure of responsibility to it. And I think Dave makes a really great point here that really encapsulates it in my mind. Even if we believe we're screwed, like, what else are you going to do? You know, what else can you do but move towards something creative? What else can you do than make the world you want to live in, and do things that make your life worth living, that make you want to get out of bed in the morning? So to me, it's really just almost like this Taoist perspective of like, yeah, let's just make the next right decision. And, you know, I don't know if you guys know the Serenity Prayer, which is used in Alcoholics Anonymous, but I went to a Catholic school, so we said it a lot there. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change and the courage to change the things I can and the wisdom to know the difference. It's sort of like, yeah, just do what I can, just move forward, move toward something beautiful, hopeful, exciting, creative, and responsible also. Is there anything else? Is there another slide?
Looks like
No.
it.
Okay.
Oh, there's
Jason, you have anything to add? Oh yeah, no, let's just skip that one. I have this. This is a really good encapsulation, but I'm not going to read it all. But go follow Trace and
Trace has a really good thread,
and read
so
it
you should find
yourself.
it. Doggy throw. Nope. Okay, stop sharing. I did it.
Yep. So I talked a lot. Jason, do you have anything to add to that?
Let's throw it to Peter. Peter, do you have any, how should we move forward? A couple questions? Should we open it up for wider conversation? What do you think?
Yeah, perhaps people can start putting their questions in the chat, and I'll call on you. You can ask your questions. I'm quite inspired by all this, and I thought you two were going to have a conversation for a bit.
Oh, are we gonna riff, Ashley?
I don't know. I don't know, Jason. One thing though, I mean, I was trying to think of the slideshow as like a very introduction, very early, you know, or basic introduction. But did I miss anything? Did I say anything there that you don't quite agree with? Because I think like part of it too is to accept some measure of diversity, and part of being a grown up also, in my opinion, and building a big tent movement is disagreeing and being able to talk about it. So like, you know, I kind of rambled on about my version of this, my vision of this. Like, does any of it differ for you? Do you want to draw any points of distinction?
Nothing differs. I think maybe I'll elaborate. So, you know, so the last session that I did, you know, I was talking about different kind of movements that were kind of, you know, I felt moving in a similar direction: localism, bioregionalism, decentralization movement, metamodernism. And, you know, as Peter knows, we both written articles about mimetic mediation, about the importance of kind of figuring out how to, you know, foster dialogue across kind of these mimetic tribal boundaries, right? And I think that the interesting thing about Doomer Optimism as a label, right, it's just a label, maybe you could call it an attractor point, is that it's very diverse, right? You have, you know, you have eco-leftists, you have kind of neo-reactionary sensibilities and everything in between. And there's a lot of fighting. People blocking each other who get like brought together under the Doomer Optimism, you know, label because they agree on certain things, and then they will fight. And I think, you know, that's fine too. Like, you know, there's people aren't going to get along, but you know, where we can, you know, where people are able, also have deep conversations, you know, try and get to the bottom of things. But you know, also realize that any big tent movement, whatever you want to call it, I don't know if it's a movement or not, it's, you know, accept the diversity and accept that you know, certain people aren't going to get along, and but that also speaks to the role of the mimetic mediator, and I definitely see you in that role, Ashley, as kind of a person who can sympathize, empathize with many different kind of orientations, and you know, bring people together that wouldn't actually talk to themselves, talk to each other. So I guess that's all I would add.
Right.
Do you have anything else to say, Ashley?
No, we can jump to questions, and basically what I had in mind too is like, I want to let people to feel free to not just ask questions of us, but to I don't know, share their experiences as Doomer optimists, or questioning Doomer optimists, or, you know, or whatever, because it's our first session. It's kind of just this emergent thing that we're playfully holding. So I'm really interested in letting people sort of co-create this with us here, and this is just going to be like this moment in time where we can refer back to, you know, the creation of this idea.
And so, given that, if you have a question or a statement, just indicate that you'd like to make a statement aloud, and I'll take you in. And I have a question for both of you for kind of like the series, and I'm quite excited by this because the Stoa is sort of consciously designed to be like a meta modern container to contain a diversity of kind of thought. We had everyone here from like ContraPoints to Alexander Dugin, so it's a pretty wild place. Um, and so, given that this is the container, what is your like hope for the series, and maybe what's something that could excite you about it? And maybe perhaps you can kind of like talk about the type of guest you want to see, and you know that type of framing of what the series is entailing.
Ashley, do you want to go?
Yeah, I can go. Yeah, I really like the worlds that I travel in, which is, you know, academics, you know, sociologists, it's kind of environmentalists. Um, there's so much doomerism, and like I think I respect that. I respect the work people have done to delineate like the problems as they exist. But I'm really excited to push people into like what's next and have conversations about that. Especially some of our big guests. I want to invite on Morris Berman, who's like just an old cranky guy who makes fun of how bad things are in the United States. Like most of his books are about that, but he's also done really good work on alternative societies, especially was looking at craft culture in Japan. He did work on horizontal consciousness in the Paleolithic, like so many cool things. So I want to try to push all of us culturally to like kind of move beyond the doom and force people to answer the question like yes and what, like what's next kind of thing. Is that's my highest hope.
Yeah, I guess I'll just add to that. I think the types of guests that we're hoping to get on are people who are definitely not naive, but definitely also have been working on, you know, usually older people. So for example, Vandana Shiva, I believe you pronounced her name right, like, you know, she's been involved with like the agroecology movement for a very long time, hoping to get her on, as well as like Chris Mahe. So looking at kind of the agricultural lens, that's kind of, you know, both of us are really interested in kind of the agricultural angle, but also someone like John Michael Greer, you know, who's kind of like, you know, on the one hand is kind of like an occultist and does magic stuff, which is interesting and kind of cool, but has also been in kind of like the appropriate tech, peak oil, you know, scene, and has written books about how he sees the future of America. Spoiler, it's pretty dark, but also like he writes books about how you can empower yourself to, to get through it, not only for yourself, but, you know, for others and communities. So I think that's kind of the general vibe, is like people who've been around for a while, who have some experience to share, and that we can interrogate them and learn from them.
Very cool. So we can probably sneak in a couple of questions. Evan, I'll take you in first.
Cool. So since they open it up for sort of some comments too, just want to say I love this. Makes me feel a lot better about my own recent life choices. So along those lines, you know, so I'm very on board, sort of spiritual friend wise, with what you're saying here. And you know, I just recently bought a place in the rural Michigan, where we're kind of gradually moving into doing some homesteading type stuff, and you know, growing some food, getting kind of on this train, if you will, especially on the agricultural side, the handcraft side, et cetera. And it's in some senses quite isolating, right? So I don't really know that many people around here, or really anywhere, that are into this sort of thing. There's some sort of old timers, you know, who have a lot of really interesting skills and knowledge probably, but have probably never heard of metamodernism, or if they have, think it's some sort of disease. So, you know, I'm just quite interested in any advice you have for like how to connect. Like you talk about localism a lot. I follow both of you on Twitter. I love what you have to say. Do you have any advice for how to connect locally with people who may never show up to the Stoa, maybe of a very different generation, you know, but to learn what we can from them, create more resilient local communities, that kind of thing. So thank you.
Ashley?
Jason, you want to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the middle of starting an experiment like that myself. So I've only been out in this kind of ruralish area for a year, but it's been the pandemic. So I'll see how it goes. I guess the one thing I will say is that you don't really need like these kind of like high concept ideas or highly online ideas like metamodernism. They're helpful if you're kind of coming into this kind of self-consciously or in a self-aware sense. But when you're actually talking about kind of pragmatic pathways for livelihood, you don't really need all this highfalutin stuff, right? So I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind. you know, you can talk to an old timer who has probably doesn't get online very much, and talk to them about like there was a guy, an elderly guy, a neighbor or a friend of a neighbor who's also an elderly woman, and the first couple times I had seen him, like he didn't seem very friendly. He didn't really like look at me or anything. But then I guess one day he saw my kid running down the street. And so one day he was driving down and he stopped, and I came over to talk to him, and he said, your kid runs so fast. Like he was just running so fast. And then he started talking about how it reminded him of his childhood and how he used to be a really fast runner and he was in football. And so then we just started talking about raising kids and the balance between like letting them kind of be free but putting some boundaries. And we just had a really lovely conversation. He's probably in his 80s, right? There was no need to invoke metamodernism or Doomer Optimism or anything else. So in terms of the isolation part, I mean, I think that can be an issue. I mean, I think there has to be a balance between like getting to know the people who've been there for a long time, so not being these huge gentrifiers, but maybe like eventually I'd like to invite a couple friends to live in the region, so then we can like so kind of have a mix of like bringing in some imports but not like gentrifying it, and like kind of having this mix of kind of the old timers or the multi-generational families, and then kind of these people who are involved in these conversations. And so but I'm still in the process, early in the process, so I'll report back.
Yeah, and I would just add, like, I'm glad Jason went, because I literally will talk for hours on this topic. It's just like everything I care about. So yeah, so just it can be both, and like you can make relationships with people locally. You don't have to talk big words or labels to them. You can find other things to talk about, and you should find ways to collaborate with one another. And then, if you really need your fix, like I do, of like intellectual conversations or conversations about ideas, then you go on Twitter or Zoom.
All right, so we have a question from Chris D, who does an excellent blog called Doomsday Parent, or Parenting, Doomsday Parenting. So I'm sure it's Jeff D, if you can be tagged in, Jeff.
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, so there was a thread on your guys' Twitter realm recently about, and it wasn't necessarily, I don't know if you guys necessarily piped in about it, but I thought you might have something interesting to say. The idea that having lots of children could be a possible part of the solution to the planetary crisis, as opposed to being this thing that most people think of as just, that is the problem. And I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on that.
I personally don't have very strong thoughts on that. Oh, is my audio cutting out? Jason, why don't you go, or can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, good. So I don't want to wade into that territory because it's a very sticky territory. But I hope that people who have strong opinions about that, one way or another, end up being a part of a panel discussion, because I can see the arguments, but I don't have a stake in one or the other outside of, I believe having children is a beautiful act of creation. and something to live for, like the most beautiful, creative act one can do. So I don't subscribe to like the zero child idea, obviously, because I have 3 kids. But I don't know if I would necessarily like go all the way in the other direction of like having 10 kids. I'm not sure. And so I just don't want to say. I don't know if Jason, you have anything to add.
Yeah, I don't really have much to add either. I have 1 kid right now. Maybe eventually I'll have 2. Um, I do think kids give you something to live for. Youthful energy is a real thing, and it should be balanced with elderly wisdom. You need both, and a society without youth is a very depressing world. But I also understand the argument about ecological boundaries and overpopulation. But I think that if there's anybody, well, maybe, I don't know if I want to say this could be misinterpreted, but if we're moving towards kind of what you can generally call degrowth lifestyles, which I think a lot of people in Doomer Optimism are, then I think the lots of kids, it's mainly the industrial world. The majority of the carbon footprint is the Western world and China, of course. Anyway, see, I'm already backing myself into like this kind of weird nuanced territory. So I probably won't.
I know, it's the worst. It's such a hard conversation to have. Jeff, can I ask Jeff? Jeff, do you have a specific point of view on this?
No, I mean, I have a child of my own, and so I'm obviously very keyed in on any kind of notion of kids being a part of a solution, and not just in terms of like, it would be a sad world without kids, but just this idea that there actually is a constructive role for child bearing and raising to have on whether or not we make it to the other side. And but my views are totally in flux on this. I don't have anything that's solidified myself.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think it's actually quite a deep question, though, and I think one we should interrogate over the series, which is, there's a whole ideology that is more or less self-loathing human ideology, because humans are this destructive creature from an environmentalist point of view. And to me, at least for me, like, I think there are ways for humans to be a creative animal, a productive animal, an animal that lives in ecological balance. And that to me is key to thinking about like how to create within those bounds. So I think totally a deep question, and something I don't have the answer to, but something we should interrogate.
Yeah. Just last thing for me, I mean, I think at the end of the day, we have to be sensitive. Like, people decide not to have kids, don't berate them. If people have decided to have quite a few kids, don't berate them. But the key thing I think Evan is getting at here in the comments is that, raising kids with an ecological consciousness to be regenerators rather than consumers, that takes care of a lot of the downside of having a lot of kids, right? Is more people that are going to regenerate the earth. That sounds pretty good.
And this seems like a rich like session on its own too. So Jeff, if you're inspired to do like a doomsday parenting session at the Stoa, that natalist natalist divide is something that merits mimetic mediation. So let's take in Chris D. Chris, you had a question above.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I'm trying to see how Doomer Optimism and homesteading fits in with the crypto community and techno-optimists who believe that their way of doing it is the system of the future. It's also clear to me that there are a lot of people who like cities. So I want to know, what are some things you think are needed to revitalize the city?
I guess, well, I mean, solar punk is a pretty solid meme, right? And so if we could have solar punk, I think we got to show that actually works, right? I don't know if the hyper dense megacities are necessarily viable unless, there was like 30% more green space or something. But then it couldn't be as dense, or maybe it could, I don't know. Might still be energy intensive. So there's a lot of, this could also be a whole session of like the future of cities. I mean, I have a lot more thoughts, but in terms of like the crypto stuff, I think I'm kind of a Luddite as well. I know that there's, people like Gregory Loundois, who's part of like the Regen network, and and they're trying to use crypto to kind of coordinate regeneration efforts and create like carbon sequestration markets and stuff like that, as well as things like Holochain, which is about like creating empowering like peer-to-peer communities. Cosmo-localism, which is about like localizing production but having kind of like a global resource design commons. So whenever the conversation is like, is technology good or bad, I think that's the wrong framing. Is a technology conducive to regenerative living or not? I think that's the real question. And sometimes it's not a clear-cut answer.
Yeah, and I would say like my bigger picture answer to this question is like, let's just try it all. And if there's a bunch of people who are really into crypto and like, it might be a solution that they can figure out how to make it work within ecological limits, good. That like I will be the biggest cheerleader for that. It's kind of above my head. So I don't want to say like necessarily it's bad. It's a little hard for me to understand exactly how it all plays out. So yeah, I mean, I think the way that I see it is, we all need to be trying everything we can possibly be trying, and seeing how it works out, and being agile with it, and not being too stuck or dogmatic, like this has to be the thing that works, but just try it, and then if it works, good.
Steve Morris, do you want to jump in, because you're kind of a booster of Holochain, and I know you have some strong opinions about like Bitcoin and stuff, but you might create some enemies just now, so tread lightly.
Sure, thanks for the invite. Well, yeah, my very biased opinion is that there's nothing regenerative in blockchain. And all you have to do is look at everybody pursuing the moon and the motivations behind it. But the human desire to thrive is what I see behind the blockchain movement. Like, I got to make money so I can be free to do the things I want to do. But the holochain technology is first and foremost human technology with biomimicry involved in the design. So it's very low energy use. If Jason and I want to do an exchange, we don't need miners in China to approve it. And you can build a local network in a community that has no outside connection and build all your software and redundancy and all of that. So there's a place for what we're calling appropriate tech. And I think crypto in that form is useful, but I don't personally see that, at least the way I've seen blockchain, and I will admit to my bias, so that hopefully I don't get taken down too hard if someone has a different opinion about that. And that's what I could say. Follow me on Twitter. That's my Twitter handle and my name if you want to tap into that crypto from the Holochain perspective. I tweet a lot of stuff about tying it into regeneration and Daniel Christian Wall's work and Nora Bateson's work.
Right. So we're almost at the top of the hour. Jason or Ashley, did you want to pick on anyone in the Zoom room? You recognize some Twitter faces, or share any kind of closing thoughts?
Well, I'd have to take some time to look through the chat. Is there anybody who wants to say anything? Just say like me at the bottom of the chat right now, and whoever does it first will tag you in.
I like this.
Okay, Ethan Holmes.
Hello there.
Oh.
Can you guys hear me all right?
Yeah?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, I know we touched on how the theory and intellectualizing of this whole thing can sometimes be counterproductive, but I was wondering if maybe now we're at a different session, you could expand on the link between metamodernism and Doomer Optimism, particularly in how Doomer Optimism is a sort of oscillatory phenomenon, a both neither situation, because I personally came into Doomer Optimism through a series of posts I made and Ashley found and commented on about, you know, doomerism and this reconciliation between, I called it the doomer and the bloomer, going back and forth. So maybe could you just give a brief comment on metamodernism, oscillation, and this Doomer Optimism?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the perspective I'm coming from. I mean, I consider myself, you know, highly interested in metamodernism before I really got into bioregionalism or, you know, regenerative anything. And yeah, I mean, oscillation is a big part of it, of being able to kind of, you know, dance between multiple perspectives, not as kind of this multi-perspectival madness, but in a constructive way of like, how can we take these apparent opposites and synthesize them somehow to create something generative, you know, not necessarily without tension, but something generative. And so I think that's definitely, I definitely approach this, you know, kind of in a meta-modern way, just, you know, the same way, like, you know, I try and bring together, like, you know, there's a term, cosmopolitan localism, right? Which this is not my term. It's been around for a while. It's been theorized for a while, but, you know, like taking these opposites and it's like, if we put these things together, is there something new that comes out? Like maybe there's not, but, you know, is there some kind of new orientation or new, like, you know, there's a lot of bathwater floating around and we just brought together two babies, right? That can happen. And I think the meta-modern kind of stage theory and cultural theory and understanding kind of the history of consciousness and thought, you know, is really useful if you're trying to play this kind of mimetic mediator kind of role. Yeah.
Thank you for the comments.
Yeah, thanks for the question.
So any closing thoughts from Ashley or Jason before we close out?
Ashley?
I just want to say that I think it would be really nice if we use this series of sessions to practice the art of conversation and disagreement. So back to Stephen's comment, like no one's coming after you in here. No one is allowed to come after anyone, like in any terrible way here. In any of our sessions, like we're gonna hopefully have like robust debate and like robust conversations, but I think like I'm gonna lay the groundwork and be the mom and say like, you guys just work it out amongst yourselves, like kind of thing. So I think that's really important too, because among all the other creative skills we have to navigate in this world of like making an entirely new system, I think one of the most essential is having those kinds of conversations respectfully. So I want to use this as like as a place to practice that skill.
Jason?
That sounds good to me. I don't have anything to add at the moment.
Yeah, that sounds good to me as well. And it's a different thing when people are talking on Twitter than when they're actually in a Zoom room and they have to talk to each other one-on-one. And so happy to facilitate that here at the STOA. Looking forward to this series beginning. And I'll circle back to Jason and Ashley to kind of get the next date. So if anyone has any, would like to kind of contribute or have any ideas, you can reach out to Jason and Ashley. That being said, thank you so much for coming to the STOA and doing the series. Super stoked. And we'll see everyone next time.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having us. Thanks for contributing. Bye.